Welcome to the April edition of Connections. As always, we begin by listening not to my words, but to the Word of God. And so please, I invite you to listen to this beautiful text from the letter of Paul to Romans, chapter 5, verse 5. Hope does not disappoint, close quote. And I chose that particular selection from Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 5, verse 5. Hope does not disappoint, because as you know, since Christmas Eve, we have begun our journey through the Jubilee year 2025. And we go through this Jubilee year 2025 surrounded by the theme, Pilgrims of Hope. Pope Francis has led us into this Jubilee year. We are now in the season of Lent. And here at the very outset, I ask for your prayers for the health of Pope Francis as he continues to lead the Church. We have learned so much from him, and we want to emulate especially those ways in which he has been an instrument of hope, who leads us to the source of hope, who is the crucified and risen Jesus. The last time that we were together was in the December edition of Connections. And we filmed and recorded that particular edition from Shepherd's Field in Bethlehem, a very historic place for being there just days before Christmas, but one that is suffering so much because of the war which exists between Israel and Hamas. Today, as we come here at the end of March, I let you know first a big development that has happened for CNEWA. The building in which we had our offices was sold. And for that reason, CNEWA moved. I have received questions and requests about why now we are in a new building space. And the answer to that is because the building we had been in for many years was sold. With the sale of that building and with some very diligent research over multiple sites and months, we found this location that can now offer space for the work that we do here in the CNEWA office. Today, this evening, we have a very special program. It's a very special program because I have a special guest who is here and is going to be interviewed by one of the finest members of the CNEWA team. First, who is our guest? Our guest this evening is Tetiana Stawnychy. Tetiana herself is the daughter of political refugees who fled Ukraine in their teenage years in 1944 to escape Soviet communism during World War II. She now finds herself, and has been since July of 2021, serving as the president of Caritas Ukraine. And we're going to hear a little bit more about the Caritas operation, that operation in Ukraine, and then together, Tetiana will have a discussion with Olivia Poust. Olivia Poust, who is CNEWA's communications officer and assistant editor to One Magazine. For those of you who are familiar with our website, I'm sure that you have learned much from reading of the research, the sharp insight, the elegant writing style that Olivia has brought to the website and to One Magazine. And so I look forward to welcoming both of them here this evening and to our listening to the insights that they have in terms of developments that have occurred, but particularly to be focused on the extraordinarily great work that is being done by Caritas in Ukraine. And with that, let me turn this over to Olivia and Tetiana.
Good evening and welcome to Connections with Monsignor Peter. As Monsignor Peter said, I'm Olivia Poust and I'm a communications officer here for the agency. I'm joined today with Tetiana Stawnychy, and she is president of Caritas Ukraine, visiting from Kyiv. Welcome, Tetiana, and welcome to Connections.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'd love to kind of start our conversation with a brief introduction of Caritas and Caritas Ukraine's work.
So Caritas was founded in Ukraine in 1991, just a little bit more than a year after the church emerged from underground experience from the Soviet period. And in those first Caritas that were founded, it was on the local level. It was in Ivano-Frankivsk, it was in Lviv, and in Kyiv were the first local Caritases that were founded. And then the network was formed in 1994. Now, Caritas is a network of local organizations affiliated with the church. They're usually based out of a parish, but registered as an individual NGO working in the country. It is the social expression of the church and the church's mission in the world, where we help people in need.
Great. So with kind of that knowledge of what you do, what are some of your main priorities in terms of programming?
So Caritas in general is a social aid organization. We help people in need. Normally for many years, we worked mostly with the elderly, with people with special needs, with children from vulnerable families. We worked around the migration issue, helping reintegrate people caught up in human trafficking, working on prevention activities for human trafficking. But in 2014, all of that changed. We moved towards responding to the humanitarian crisis that was looming at that time in the eastern part of the country. And over the next 8 years, we gained a lot of experience doing humanitarian aid in the East. And we were poised in 2022 to be able to provide a very substantive response to the crisis that unfolded after February 24th, 2022.
And could you give us a little bit of a status update kind of on the situation of the war? I know that you've mentioned when you presented to CNEWA earlier today that it's not just an ongoing conflict, but actually it's now escalating again. So can you kind of break that down a little bit?
Sure. The escalations actually started at the end of the summer. If we even just look at the number of drone attacks that were happening in Ukraine, for most of 2024, the first probably 8 months, it was around 300 or 400 drone attacks per month. It started to rise, the number of attacks started to rise at the end of August, and they continue to rise where today, the last month we had 4,000 drone attacks in a single month in Ukraine. And these are attacks that happen all over the country in various cities and civilian regions.
So how has that affected the requests from Caritas and then your response, having that escalation?
Yeah, so overall, Caritas works both in frontline areas, providing aid and evacuations for people who are vulnerable, who need to get moved out of dangerous zones. We also work with people who are displaced, and we also work in areas after certain missile strikes or drone strikes. Usually that can be providing psychosocial support to people. It can involve helping to provide repairs to homes that are damaged by shelling or fighting or bombs.
Sure. And there is a distinction between then emergency and humanitarian aid versus kind of these long-term projects. And I'd like to know a little bit more in the area of education, because really since COVID-19, children have just been in crisis after crisis in Ukraine. And I'm curious about how your response has dealt with that and kind of adapted to their needs in living through a war and the trauma that comes with that.
Yeah. So children have always been a focus for Caritas organizations. We started some really interesting work after 2014 in that first stage of the war. We developed a methodology for child-friendly spaces where we work with children. We help them to work through their trauma, socialize. We also do some work with their parents, with the adults. And that way we're stabilizing not just the child, but also the adults that are around the child. We also developed a super program in schools. We call it psychosocial support in schools, and where we create a room that's separate from the regular learning environment where most of the students are studying, where we work with them to overcome traumas, to learn various coping mechanisms, resilience skills. And we work not only with the students, we also work with the parents and the teachers. It was one of my favorite projects when I joined Caritas in 2021. Because the teachers made comments that the whole atmosphere in the school had changed. So we really see that program as a way of stabilizing both the school and the community where the school is located in.
Great.
The children are really suffering a lot. Many children are not able to attend a school at all because there aren't enough bomb shelters in schools. So we probably have 1/3 of students are learning offline. 1/3 of students are fully online, and then we have another 1/3 that are in a hybrid format of study where there might be a bomb shelter, but it's not big enough to house all the students so that they take turns doing on and offline study. And one of the things that we find is that there's both a need for education catch-up, so to be working with the children, helping them to work through some of the difficulties in the programs that they've missed in school. The other piece that is so important is the socialization, and again, working through traumatic events, helping them to express themselves, helping them to learn how to socialize and have dialogue with others. And that's one of the top asks that we have from many of the parents with our children's centers.
Yeah, and going on these program visits, have you witnessed kind of the positive effects of that in action?
Yes, 100%. You see, and not only, there's a lot of different aspects of these programs. So on the one hand, you have children who are opening up. Yeah, they start to be children again, they play, they start to socialize. But another aspect of it is, especially in areas where you have a lot of displaced children, is the integration factor, where we often mix children from the host community and children who are displaced, and that they learn to form relationships in that new community. They learn about different traditions in that particular community where they're living, and it's a really great tool, and also not only to help the children to integrate, but also the whole family to integrate into their new situation.
That's great. Another point you mentioned kind of as a priority was community activation, and I would love to know a little bit more about that, what that means and what that looks like in terms of implementing it.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite programs in Caritas. We started working in 2017-18 on a program called Development of Parish Social Ministry, where we go into parish communities and we talk with them about the social needs in their area. We usually end up working with a core group of people who identify things that they'd like to work on, that they'd like to address in their communities. And then we have immediately a small micro grant competition where they can write up their project ideas and apply for some micro funding to get started. It's a really great way of bringing people together, helping them to create a community that is responding to the needs of their neighbors around them. So, and that is one of the programs that we have also run through some of the CNEWA financing. And it's a really important part of creating resilience in people. So when you have a crisis, the best thing that you can do is to start acting and responding and helping other people. It's a great way of coping with the situation and of creating inner resilience in a very difficult situation.
In terms of resilience, I don't know if it was the last time you were here, you mentioned a lot of your staff are people who were IDPs or who were greatly affected by the war in some way. So I'm curious a little bit about your staff and the people who are volunteering with Caritas and working for you, kind of how Caritas has affected their lives in a way too.
Yeah, one of my the great stories that we have found since the beginning of this full-scale invasion is the way that people move through the Caritas system. Very often we have people come to receive aid, humanitarian aid from us, and once they get on their feet, they come back and they become Caritas volunteers. In fact, about 40% of our volunteers are IDPs who used to receive aid from us and then came back to be able to help others. I think for people who've received assistance, when you're really in need and you've received assistance, there's something in you then that wants to give back and wants to continue that goodness into the world, and it's actually very inspiring. It's also, I think, part of a healing process. Yeah, I remember, I think I shared this story early on about people who told me that when they came to volunteer in Caritas or when they got a job in Caritas, after they'd lived through these traumatic displacements and losing everything and being heartbroken, that every time they would help somebody, they felt like a piece of their heart was stitched back together. It was really beautiful stories that we have inside the network, and there's many of them. Yeah.
So are your local networks primarily volunteer-based, kind of on those parish level?
We have a mix.
Okay.
We have a mix. We both have volunteer programs, and then we also have regular funded programs where you need to have professionals, psychologists and caseworkers, nurses, doctors who are actually working on the specific programming.
In terms of the needs on the ground, I know there's a little bit of variety there. I mean, there's food need, medical, water, shelter, things like that. What are the greatest priorities right now? And is it still, would you say, primarily emergency-based, or are you shifted mainly into long-term projects as your main focus?
Yeah, it's actually both. There's still huge needs in the eastern part of the country. You still have huge needs with emergency assistance, with people evacuating who are very vulnerable. Very often they're not mobile, or they're very elderly, they've been left alone, they don't have anybody to take care of them. And so one of the things that Caritas works on is we work in various transit points where we might provide hot food hot meals as people come into a transit point. We also help with some of the evacuations, bringing them to the transit point and then getting them to a more, at least medium-term place where they can stay for a longer time. On the one hand. On the other hand, we also have these crisis centers. We have child-friendly spaces all over the country where we're helping people both cope with the war and the effects of the war, and also especially with a focus on people who are displaced and helping them to find their way into a new community.
How many beneficiaries does Caritas have as of now?
Yeah, so we've helped since the beginning over 3.5 million beneficiaries. In the first year, it was over 2 million. It was a huge number simply because there were a lot of people on the move. At that time, 14 million people crossed the country, either displacing inside or moving further, going abroad. So there was a huge need for quick assistance, maybe 1 or 2 days, and then people would move on. As that time went on, the aid that we provide, it needs to go deeper. And so it's no longer just this quick response helping people on their way, but actually helping them psychologically, helping them to settle, helping them to find jobs, helping them to find a place to live. And then in 2023, we had about 800,000 beneficiaries, and this last year there was about 500,000 people who were aided by Caritas programs.
That's amazing. Well, thank you for your work and for joining us today. I'd like to invite Monsignor Peter back into this conversation to kind of conclude and wrap it up. So thank you again.
Thanks.
Thank you. So let me express my gratitude. Tetiana, you've given us deeper insight once again into the mission of Caritas, and I can assure you of our support, our prayerful support. And I know that following us later on today, we'll have a meeting with our director of programs so that once again we can try to deepen the alignment and the collaboration between CNEWA and Caritas. And I thank you so much for the many, many ways in which you have guided us, for the sacrifice which you continue to make in your leadership, and for your entire staff. I really am very grateful for your presence here. Olivia, thank you so much for your insight. Thank you so much for the ways in which you have today engaged Tetiana in this conversation, which I think is most important for our viewers, but also for your constant endeavors, in particular in terms of your writing on the website and all of the reflections that you have offered, which only allow for our viewers and for our readership to become more aware of the mission of CNEWA, and how the mission of CNEWA is never done in isolation. The mission of CNEWA is done with other groups, often with other groups like Caritas Ukraine. And so I thank you for the ways in which you have consistently brought that together, and how you have certainly brought that out, the both of you, in this conversation that we have had here today. I'm very grateful. I just have a few closing comments to make, and the first one is just to update everyone on the activity of the CNEWA office in Rome. As I said before, the last meeting, the last opportunity that I had to be with you was right before Christmas. It's been since then, it was in January, that CNEWA's office in Rome has now been registered. And so being registered in Rome, we are able to both promote the mission of CNEWA, but also now to ask for donations, to ask for donations from people in Italy and throughout the EU that can help the mission of CNEWA in the different places where we work. And so I think that's something that is worthy of updating you in terms of what CNEWA does as we continue to expand our own mission. Second comment that I'd like to make with reference to the office in Rome is that at the end of April, on Monday, April 28th, and then on Tuesday, April 29th, we're going to be involved in the sponsorship of two very interesting evenings. On the 28th, we'll be involved in the sponsorship of a conversation that will take place among Vatican journalists, followed by a reception and by a dinner. And then on Tuesday, April 29th, we will be received at the Dicastery for the Eastern Churches. There, the prefect, His Eminence Cardinal Gugerotti, will receive CNEWA and all of our guests at another reception. On both of these occasions, you'd be able to get a little more familiar with our mission. And for those who might be visiting Rome at that time, you'd be most welcome. I would just ask you, if you know that you're going to be in Rome on April 28th or on April 29th, that you just write to me here at CNEWA and let me know that you'll be there so that we can give you more direction in terms of where you might be able to join us. And we'd be happy to welcome you and happy to share a little bit more about the mission of CNEWA's office in Rome. If I may add one last thing about the office in Rome. Today, on this Monday, March 31st, where there is another event taking place at the Pio, that is at the Pontifical Oriental Institute in Rome. That is being done by a combination of the Sheptytsky Institute and other educational institutions, including the Pio itself. But CNEWA is present. The Rome office of CNEWA and the team from CNEWA staff are all present to assist in that operation. And we're very happy for the great work that they're doing there. A final note that I will just make in terms of sharing information with you is that I'm also very happy to announce that we have a new director of development. His name is Brian McGinley. So we're very happy to welcome Brian to the executive staff here at CNEWA. And I am hoping, as I look toward his schedule, that in one of the future editions of Connections, I will be able to also sit here with Brian, and we'll all be able to listen to Brian's insights and the ways in which he might suggest that you can support CNEWA. So again, I thank you. As always, I thank you first for your prayer. Second, I thank you for being attentive to how we are trying to get the news out there, for you to hear the news and hear it in the way that we feel is most accurate. And Olivia is a major part in doing that on a regular basis. And third, yes, I am CNEWA's chief beggar. So I'm also here to see what I can do to ask for your donations and your generosity to help CNEWA in the execution of our mission. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you at the May edition of Connections.